Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our presentation on fear effects. Next slide, please. So fear effects are scientifically known as non-consumptive effects, and they refer to the reaction and consequential behavior of animals perceived as prey in relation and interaction to animals perceived as predators. So what that basically means is fear effects is the word used to describe the animal instincts from smaller animals that are usually seen as prey and how they react when they feel like a predator is coming. And I'm going to move on to the next slide where we're going to define fear effects.
Thank you, Jennifer. So when we talk about fear effects, we normally talk about trophic cascade. So what is trophic cascade? Trophic cascade refers to indirect reactions for an entire ecosystem based on predator interactions. So an example of this is how seaweed prosper because of sharks' interactions. So during high tide in a coral reef, sharks come out to hunt the fish, and the fish inevitably they hide to avoid being eaten by the shark. When the fish hide, they're not eating the seaweed. So during high tide, when the sharks are out roaming for food, the seaweed grow and prosper more because there are no more fish to eat them. And during low tide, when the sharks can't swim in the coral reef, and when the sharks are not there, the seaweeds are being eaten by the fish, and the seaweed are not prospering. Another thing found in the study is that in the higher altitudes of the coral reef, where the fish are not hiding, the fish are hiding in the lower altitudes. In the higher altitudes, the seaweed is growing more and prospering. And in the lower altitudes, the seaweed is not that prevalent because that's where the fish are hiding and that's where the fish are eating.
Building on what Zaid said, an example that would be found outside this podcast would be the growth of trees like aspen and wolves being reintroduced to the environment. So in Yellowstone National Park, there were no wolves for about 70 years. And during that time, elk had a very high population, and they would kind of put a burden on the growth of trees such as aspen and plants such as willow. After the reintroduction of wolves, we saw that elk over the 70 years were no longer afraid of wolves, but the burden that they placed on trees like aspen was gradually decreasing, causing aspen to population to boom and explode and grow freely. With that, we saw more habitats open up for native birds, and many of other species were allowed to be reintroduced to the ecosystem just because the wolves came back. Also, another effect of the wolves would be coyotes were also this environment, and they would prey on a species called pronghorn. Pronghorn saw a drastic increase in their population due to the fact that coyotes were no longer there because wolves would prey on them. And just building on the idea that Zaid said, we can see how predators can really affect the environment.
As we know, there are many fearful animals in the world, but as we know, one of the most fearful animals is the lion. The lions are the king of the jungle because of their raw power and strength. Lions roar to scare other animals and predators away, and this is what is most associated with lions being feared. If they have to fight another predator, they will roar to try and scare away the predator rather than fight if they can. Like a king, lions also maintain order. A king maintains order by making laws and punishing those who don't abide by them. A lion maintains a balance by killing some animals, and if there are no lions, herds of antelope would overcrowd the savannas and destroy all types of grass resources. As we know, everything impacts something. Another fearful animal in the animal kingdom is the orca, known as the killer whale. Combining both brains and bronze, orcas have been known to kill sharks in surprisingly complicated ways. Some would drive their prey to the surface and then karate chop them with an overhead tail swipe. Others seem to have worked out that they can hold sharks upside down to induce a paralytic a paralytic state called tonic immobility. Even the mighty sperm whales fear orcas and group together to defend themselves. Instead of trying to beat a faster, more agile enemy, they coordinate attacks in a group in a disadvantaged direct physical battle. Another interesting fact is that dogs can sense fear in other animals and humans, and this is beneficial in a gouging fight, but also a way of giving them a social cue that they should be afraid as well. This is a fear effect within the dog that might not help in being a predator, but rather as being a social animal. And I'll pass it over to Jennifer.
One prominent example of how NCE affects the environment is Fiji's Great Sea Reef. So I have a little bit of a video to show you guys. And this video explains how NCEs affect the coral reef.
One time, researchers did not think trophic cascades even existed in the real world, and many still debate whether sharks can drive trophic cascades on coral reefs. By observing reef communities in Fiji's Votua Marine Reserve, Rasher and his team discovered that sharks do in fact influence plant growth on the reefs by scaring the herbivorous fish away from eating them. Here's how it works. When the tide rises, sharks make hunting raids into the shallow lagoons. The fish stop eating and hide instead. But during low tide, the predators are isolated in deeper waters, unable to access the reef enclosed lagoons. That's when the fish can safely graze.
All of the fish in the system have a very keen sense of when the tide is coming up and when the tide is going out. If you just sort of sit there and watch through the transition, you see as particularly with the large herbivores, as the tide starts to drop, they seem to know it and they jet, and it's really predictable.
The upshot is that the deeper parts of the reef are more extensively grazed, while seaweed grows more freely on the higher parts of the reef that are accessible to the fish only when they're focused on avoiding becoming a shark's lunch. The results are in the journal Scientific Reports. For Rasher, these findings mean that the question is no longer whether sharks influence the dynamics of reef plant and animal communities, but instead under what conditions they do so.
Predators can have important impacts on coral reefs, but we need to look carefully to determine when and where those important impacts exist.
And that brings us back to the effects of NCEs on the environment. Another really quick example that I wanted to give for this is how pufferfish usually get big when they sense a predator is coming. And I can only imagine how many animals in the animal kingdom have the same reaction. And it's interesting to note that they are all caused by the NCE instincts. Next slide, please. We have a few questions for you. Thank you for listening to our presentation. So the first question is, trophic cascades has to do with whose interactions? Who controls the ecosystem? And the second question is, what animals do you think of when you think of fear effects? And thank you for listening to our presentation. Okay, I feel like when we do the questions, we can stop